Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining today's AHRQ Safety Program for ICUs, Preventing CLABSI and CAUTI NC State Call Number 3. We like these meetings to be very interactive, so we're anticipating that you will be highly engaged in today's session. We encourage you to ask questions and share information throughout the webinar today, and we will keep all lines muted to cut down on feedback, distractions, and echoing. Before we get started, I'd like to go over the logistics for today's session. As mentioned before, all lines are currently muted and in listen-only mode. During Q&A, we ask if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment by raising your hand. You can click on the hand icon on the Grab tab located on the left side of your control panel, and your line will be unmuted. Please announce your name and organization prior to speaking. Feel free to also ask questions or make comments using your question box located in your control panel throughout the session, and we will address questions as they come in. This session is being recorded and will be made available on the NCHA website and through email notification shortly after the conclusion of today's session. Presenting for you today is Claudia Perrins, Patient Safety Director, Katie Sider-Palladino, Hospital-Acquired Infection Epidemiologist, and Karen Southard, Clinical Consultant. At this time, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Claudia.
Thanks, Sarah. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us once again. This is our third call, and we're thrilled that you were able to call in. Just real quick, our agenda for today will be a quick review of what your CUSP team should be working on for months 4 and 5, which is November and December. And then we will walk through a sample case study of the ICU action plan, which pretty much all of the ICUs have submitted, and how that sample ICU might implement small PDSA cycles of change. And then Katie from the Department of Public Health will help us understand the data and reports that are in the AHRQ CDS system and how you can use those reports as part of your action planning and sharing that information with your team. And we will close with an open forum. So just a brief program recap to help you and your team know where you should be at. Ideally, you have sent me your CUSP team roster. So this was not, bless you. This was not an original ask. This was a later ask. I've received about 5 of these so far. This is to help us know who is on your team. So if you have not sent that, please do. We are checking those off as they come in. Also, we would ask that you take a photo of your team with them holding the Why I Care page. In the handout section, there is still the handout section of the platform today. You can access the Why I Care page so that you could print that out for the next time you meet with your CUSP team, so people can write, why they care about patient safety and this program. Take a picture with your team and send that to us so we can gather those and display them in one of our upcoming calls. And then, of course, anytime that you have a new infection, if you're focusing on CAUTI or CLABSI, we'd encourage you to do a deep dive, many sort of learning from defects or root cause analysis on it. Also, we would love for you to schedule safety rounds with your senior leadership, and this is leadership rounding on staff. I'm also really excited to share that in the January virtual learning group call that will be through the AHRQ platform, one of our ICUs, so the Wake Med Medical ICU, will be sharing about what they do for their safety rounds with leadership. So that's really exciting. I think Chris is on the call today, so and Chris will be helping to speak during that virtual learning group. So they've got some great practices there. Also, you should be meeting regularly with your CUSP team to talk about kind of where you are and the work that you're doing, particularly talking about your action plan and your PDSA cycles, which again, that's something we'll talk about in this call. monitoring the progress of your action plan, and then last but not least, utilizing the on-demand modules. So just briefly, I want to draw your attention to the on-demand modules that exist in the AHRQ CDS platform. They're under the education section, and these present the latest evidence-based practices for CLABSI and for CAUTI, and I've got listed here how long they are. So they're all pretty short. You can access them at any time, so night shift, day shift, and we've been told that some of the questions that are coming through on the listserv are actually questions that can be answered if people would go ahead and reference these modules. The nice thing about the modules also is that they have the notes listed. So if you don't want to listen to it and you just want to read the notes real quick, you can look at the notes. It's also got all of the references listed, so they're pretty useful. And hopefully in the next month or so, AHRQ has promised us that they will be providing each hospital kind of a generic link so that anybody that has that log-on information will be able to access the CDS modules, and you won't have to have, a unique username and password for each person. So they've promised us that that's coming. I'm really looking forward to that so that you can share these more broadly. Okay, so next I would like to get into our case study, and a little bit of a disclaimer. So this is about a generic ICU that I made up. So it's a fictional generic ICU based purely on my imagination. And any resemblance to actual ICUs, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. And this ICU is participating in our ICU safety project and focusing on CAUTI. And in preparation for doing their ICU action plan, they did some data review. And looking at 2017 to 2018, they had 4 CAUTIs, but didn't identify any specific trends. However, their SIR, so their number of predicted infections, is more than predicted, so they know they have some opportunities. And taking a look at their utilization, they've seen a nice overall decreasing trend in their utilization. So that's some information, background information on this, again, fictional generic ICU that they've gathered as they were preparing their action plan. So some of the gaps and opportunities that they filled in is that in their emergency department, almost every patient that's going to be transferring to their ICU receives a urinary catheter. And also in their ICU, they have experienced significant nursing turnover. So they've got a lot of younger, inexperienced staff on their team. Fortunately for them, based on their AHRQ assessment that they filled out, they have really excellent tools, practices, and policies available to them, but there's some question about whether or not they're actually following the policy for appropriately bladder scanning patients after catheter removal, or whether they're just kind of jumping ahead and replacing Foley catheters. And lastly, one of their gaps or opportunities is that while they have a hospital-wide implementation of urine culture stewardship, they don't actually have a local physician champion in that ICU to lead the initiative. So I'm wondering if there's anything there that you guys can relate to. So this fictional ICU developed an aim statement to create a 25% reduction of urinary catheters by June 2019. So that would be sort of the equivalent of decreasing their utilization. And then they also have this secondary aim, which ideally they would like to decrease the number of urinary catheters that are placed by their AD team, or increase the number of alternatives that are used by the ED team. But they feel like the emergency department's not very interested in partnering with them at this point in time. So that's kind of their secondary aim if, everything goes really, really well. Some of the strengths that they identified in their action plan that they might pull on to help them are that they have great processes in place already for their central lines and reducing their bloodstream infections. Also, the staff on that unit feel a real sense of pride and provide excellent patient care. Also, the hospital as a whole has a commitment to reducing CAUTI. They've placed this metric on their quality dashboard, and a hospital-wide team meets on a quarterly basis after their infection prevention committee meetings. So there is a focus on this. Again, this is a fictional ICU that I made up. So for their action plan, regarding the question, what will happen, this is what they said was going to happen. They were going to re-educate their nursing staff on appropriate indications for indwelling urinary catheters, and then also re-educate the staff on alternatives to urinary catheters during huddles with the help of clinical education. So they're really fortunate that they do have a part-time clinical nurse educator on the unit. And then lastly, they want to do a daily review of urinary with the intensivist and make sure that there is corresponding EMR or EHR documentation. And they want to stress to get the catheter out early and keep it out. So I think they feel this ICU has a pretty good action plan. And in my coaching with them, I would say I feel like they are on the right track based on the fact that they are primarily focusing on what would be considered Tier 1 interventions to CAUTI. And any ICU would want to really maximize their approach to Tier 1 before they moved on to Tier 2. So for your ICU, if you're working on CAUTI, that's also something that you should take a look at and reference this slide, that you're going to want to optimize your approach to Tier 1 before you're moving on to focus on your practices for Tier 2. If you're focusing on CLABSI, I've also included this slide for you. And again, these are AHRQ slides. So these are the evidence-based practices for reducing your bloodstream infections. And it's a really good gauge to see whether or not what you've decided to focus on based on your gaps and opportunities is in line with where you should be. So let's kind of skip over to Plan, Do, Study, Act, right? So I've said that this fictional ICU has an action plan, and now at this stage, right, for November, December, they should be working on their action plan. And what exactly does that look like if they're going to be doing PDSA? So PDSA is really just a tool. It is a cycle and shorthand for testing a change by planning it, trying it, observing the results, and acting on what is learned. So it's scientific method, like hypothesis testing, science projects that you did when you were in school, but used for action-oriented learning. So the steps of PDSA are, step 1, you're going to plan. So you're going to plan the test or observation, including a plan for how you're going to be sure that you're collecting data to measure an improvement. Step 2 is you're going to actually do it. So you're going to try out the test on a small scale. Step 3, you're going to study. So you're going to set aside time to analyze the data and study the results. And then step 4 is act. So you're going to refine the change based on what was learned from the test. And as clinicians, you're doing this rapid cycle test of change all the time, and you don't even realize it. Plus, you do this in your personal life, and you probably don't consider it continuous improvement, but it really is. So I want to give you an example, relatively simple example, that we can all relate to kind of exemplify how we are doing this continuous rapid cycle improvement on a regular basis. So for this example, I'm going to step away from CAUTI and CLABSI for a second, and we're going to go back in time and assume that I am just starting my job here at NCHA. And my first few days, I'm told to arrive at 8:30 for orientation. And then after that, I'm told I need to regularly plan to arrive at work at 9 a.m. So my aim or goal is that I want to arrive on time to work, right? I'm a new employee, want to make a good impression. The caveat is that I also prefer to leave as late as possible in order to maximize all the sleep that I can get, because I cherish my sleep time. So based on the Google Maps here, you can see that there's kind of 3 general routes that I can take, and it should take me roughly 20 to 25 minutes to get to work. Now we know that I can adjust the time I leave for work, but like I said, I don't want to get up too early if I can help it. So this is, now in real life, you wouldn't be filling out a test of change worksheet for getting to work on time. But again, this is just an example. So let's say for this demonstration, Friday is my first real day of work after orientation. And I took the shortest distance, which was the 9.3 miles, but it took me 35 minutes with traffic. And again, it should only take 20 to 25 minutes to get to work. So I come up with my aim statement, which is to get to work at 9 a.m. and my plan. So this is my plan, that I'm going to try the second shortest route, which is 9.9 miles. And I kind of have to figure out the answers to all these questions. Again, I'd be doing this all in my head, but for the sake of a worksheet, I'm writing this all down. So who's going to be involved? Obviously, that's just me. When will it take place? Let's say Monday's a holiday, so I'm going to try Tuesday morning at 8:35. Where will it take place? It's going to be my route from home to work. And what am I measuring? So I'm measuring my arrival time at work. And what I predict will happen is that I'm going to have an on-time arrival. Now, the do portion of this is the try it out. So what happens with the do? So the do, well, I didn't try it out on Tuesday because Tuesday was a snow day. So I tested it out actually on Wednesday. So that's what was actually done in WIN. I tested out on Wednesday and I didn't leave at 8:35, it left at 8:38 because I just wasn't leaving quite on time. And what were my unexpected observations or problems? Well, turns out I didn't know that the neighborhood kids are picked up at the end of the street. There's a bus stop. And so they were getting picked up right as I was leaving. So I had to wait for the bus and all the kids to get on the bus. And then as soon as I got to the stop sign at the end of my neighborhood, really heavy traffic. Unexpected observations. So I fill out the analyzing my results here in my study part. So what was my actual arrival time? It was 9:16, which means it took me 38 minutes to get to work, meaning I was late, not good. Did the results differ from my expectations? Absolutely. I did not expect that I was going to run into that bus stop pickup. And what did I learn, right? So I learned that I have to be past that corner before 8:30 because there's a huge crowd of kids and their parents waiting there for the bus. So ACT is the refine. And for the refine, what action am I going to take? Well, I'm going to abandon route 2. I've decided I'm going to try route 3, and I'm going to depart before 8:30. So that is a continuous rapid cycle change, something that you do obviously without a worksheet generally. And it's the plan, do, study, act. So you plan, you make a small test of change, you know what will be considered a measurable improvement, you try it out, then you study or analyze the results, and then based on the results, you act, you refine the change, okay? Hopefully that's an example we can all relate to. So let's go back now to CAUTI and CLABSI and my generic ICU case study. So if you recall, I said that one of their action items was to re-educate staff. So this might be their PDSA worksheet for executing their action plan, right? So they fill out their plan of what they're going to do. First, they have to come up with their aim. And they say their aim is they're going to educate all their RNs about appropriate indications for indwelling urinary catheters in the ICU. And then I just made it up, like what is their plan? So let's say they're going to do a pre-test and post-test, and they're going to do 20-minute in-service. They pick the days and times, where they're going to educate them in the break room. Again, how are they going to measure a change or improvement? They're going to measure change based on the number of staff that are educated, but then also improved post-test scores. And then they have to actually try it out. They have to do it. So, you know, the best laid plans don't always go the way you hope. In my made-up ICU situation, they weren't able to train as much as they expected, right? So, turns out they only did half the trainings because of short staffing. Also, their results weren't quite what they expected. They weren't able to train 100% of the staff. And during the trainings, they found out that the nurses were actually already really knowledgeable about the appropriateness indications. And they heard in the training that some of the staff feel that urinary catheters make their job easier, especially when they have a double or triple assignment. So for their study of looking at analyzing their results, they found that the nurses already had very high pretest scores. And then for their action, deciding what are their next steps, obviously they would need additional sessions to educate the rest of the staff because they weren't able to do all their sessions. But they also need to determine whether or not are they going to move forward with these education sessions, or are they going to completely change the plan and decide, hey, we need to explore why staff feel that the urinary catheters make their job so much easier, and is this like a cultural thing that staff are relying on the urinary catheters despite the fact that the patient doesn't meet appropriate indications. So this would be like their first worksheet for CAUTI education, and then they would fill out another one depending on what the team decided to do. So here would be a sample worksheet for their CAUTI daily review. So again, their aim statement for this one might be their aim is to do a daily review of necessity during rounds with the intensivist. And then specifically what exactly they're going to do, my made-up ICU said that they're going to have the care nurse and the charge nurse ask intensivists during rounds why the patient needs a urinary catheter and then document it. They wrote exactly who was going to do it, when they were going to do it. Now when, they said, they put, again, this is small tests of change, so they put just one day. They started with the first day. daily rounds tomorrow on Thursday. It's going to take place in the ICU, and specifically what they were going to measure was the percent of patients meeting appropriateness criteria and the percent of patients being documented on. They made a prediction, so their hypothesis about what would happen. They said, just guessing, about a third of the patients weren't going to meet appropriateness criteria, and 80% of the patients will have complete documentation. So then, after they actually do this on Thursday, they would come back and fill in the do, study, and act section. So I'm making this up. Let's say this is what happens. Say on daily rounds on 12/13, only 10 of the 15 patients were they able to ask about the why they had the urinary catheter because of interruptions during rounds. And the charge nurse asked the care nurse to document the reason, but turns out they didn't have a process in place for auditing that the care nurse actually documented it. One of their unexpected observations was that the intensivist, Dr. No-No in this case, he simply says that eyes and nose are the reason that the patient has a urinary catheter. And turns out this is not an appropriate indication because this hospital bases their policy on the Ann Arbor criteria. And Ann Arbor criteria is actually really specific. So in terms of studying, analyzing the results, they don't have all of the results pending. And what they learned is that they need a process to audit the documentation. And actually, this Dr. No-No intensivist needs some re-education about the appropriateness indications in their own policy. So again, this is a small test of change. So their action, this ICU, they decided that for tomorrow, they're going to try it with another intensivist. They need to come up with a plan for physician education. They'll find out whether or not it's just this Dr. No-No intensivist or whether or not it's other intensivists that also are not well versed on their hospital policy. And they also will need to come up with a plan for auditing their documentation. They don't have that plan for tomorrow, so they're going to continue with just asking the question so that they're moving forward with their action plan, and they'll regroup and come up with what they're going to do around auditing the documentation. So they would fill out tomorrow a new PDSA worksheet. So hopefully that kind of gives you an idea of what the benefits are of doing these small tests of change and using a worksheet. It's easy to use. It helps keep your team on track and on the same page. And it builds kind of this real progressive momentum. The nice thing, as you can see, is that it really does help you identify those challenges and roadblocks early on so that you can address them and refine your plan. You know, if you read about PDSA, one of the things they say is that before you do a large-scale implementation, it totally makes sense to do these, PDSA on a much smaller scale. It's like piloting an intervention, which, of course, you guys are familiar with. And then the nice thing about it is it's scalable. And Karen, anything you want to add about the benefits of doing PDSA?
Thanks, Claudia. I think one of the key things too that I've been encouraging with PDSA cycles is that, you know, when you have a worksheet and you have it documented, then you can share it at your CUS team meeting, and you can really quantify what's working, the means to brainstorm for some possible solutioning if things aren't going the way you had planned to go. It's also great to post up on your bulletin boards next to your data so that people can see that you're actively working on it and what you are already doing. So it's a great way for messaging during huddles or things like that to prompt staff to know, you know, what what you're trying to achieve and where you are in that process. So I would just encourage you to think about using the PDSA worksheets in those manner, and just see if it maybe doesn't accelerate your momentum of change.
Yeah, thanks for that, Karen. I mean, the other nice thing about posting it and sharing it is if you are doing your safety leadership rounds focused on CAUTI and CLABSI, it's definitely something you can share with your leader when they come around and have staff talk about. Again, it's something that clinicians do on such a regular basis that they don't even think of it as continuous cycles of change. I want to point out that you are not required to use a worksheet. This is not something that we will be collecting, but it is helpful to document these things on a worksheet from time to time. So there are a lot of worksheets out there. You're welcome to use the worksheet, CMS. The one I use, then this is the work, one of the AHRQ, if you prefer this format. So there's a lot of options out there. Your organization might have its own PDSA worksheet. So it's just a format and a tool. Again, your organization might have its own tool, but it's a way to have things written down. So I'm going to stop there for a second and see if there's any questions or comments about this generic ICU and its action planning and working on the action plan before we talk about understanding. So if you have any questions or comments, if you could type them in or raise your hands. I'm going to brave the silence and let you guys identify yourselves if you have anything you want to ask or say. You can do this. Be brave. Can you believe that was only 20 seconds of silence? Felt like a lot, huh? Questions or comments, and ask them or type them in. So I will go ahead and Katie to get us started in the CDS. Should have.
Okay.
I want to encourage you guys, make sure you get your question time because it is for you. We'll go ahead and share her brilliance with us.
Claudia. Yeah, so if you out there like data discussion will here because it can of measures that are being collected as part of this project. And so you can think of these as sort of in two different buckets. So you have out are your ultimate goals, what you want to achieve. So the goal of this is to have lower in and another way to look at that is by looking at a specific rate ratio. And next couple of slides. Fine, where do we hope to that we want to see end of this project? There's sort of, are you making progress? And so one of the things that associated infection increase risk of getting infections. And so looking first at those outcome measures, at those measures that are the goals that we're trying to reach through this project, we want to see lower CAUTI and CLABSI rates, and this can also be measured with the standardized infection ratio, which we'll talk about in a bit. So these measures are collected monthly during the project, so you'll be able to see these in your CDS graphs, and they're on a monthly basis. And so they are collected for 12 months prior to when you all started the intervention, and then during the 12 months of the implementation or the program period. And so you should be able to see that time period on your graphs. And as part of this project, we've collaborated with NCHA and you all, of course, so that we are submitting data on your behalf that is uploaded into CDS. So the information that whoever is in charge of your NHSN data, they're putting in the data for your facility, for your unit, that gets reported to us, and then we are uploading it to CDS on your behalf. So let's use, as an example, let's look at these CAUTI measures. And the measures between CAUTI and CLABSI are very similar. So I'll just use CAUTI as our example here. So two of these measures that are collected monthly are incidence rate as well as your utilization rate as well. And so the incidence rate is looking at, just your unit, the number of CAUTIs that were identified for a certain period of time, divided by the number of urinary catheter days for that same period of time. And then we multiply by a factor of 1,000 to make that number large enough to understand. It's difficult sometimes to interpret if you have a incidence rate of 0.025 CAUTIs per urinary, however many urinary catheter days. So we use that multiplier of 1,000 to make them a little bit easier to understand. So that's the incidence rate of infections over the measure of risk, which is the number of urinary catheter days. And the next measure to look at is the urinary catheter utilization ratio. And so to get that number, it's the number of urinary catheter days over the number of patient days for that same time period. So you want to make sure you have apples to apples here, times a multiplying factor of 100. Again, just to make the numbers a little bit easier to understand. So while your incidence rate is looking at, what are our outcomes? How many CAUTIs are we getting per urinary catheter days? The urinary catheter utilization ratio is saying, how many urinary catheters are we putting in per number of patient days? And that gets into that process measure where if you decrease your utilization, you're going to decrease your risk for someone developing a CAUTI, and hopefully you'll see that incidence rate go down. And as I mentioned, these calculations are very similar for CLABSI as well. So for CLABSI, you can also calculate the incidence rate of CLABSIs per 1,000 urinary catheter days, and you can also do the same for central line utilization ratio. Okay, so next, once my slide moves forward here, have a little bit of a pause here. I apologize for that. Yeah, and Claudia, if you're able to have control too, feel free to advance the next slide as well. But in the next slides, we're going to talk about those standardized infection ratio and the standardized utilization ratio, which allow you to compare to other units and other facilities across the United States. And your infection preventionist or whoever enters your NHSN data is able to get this information to compare to other facilities or to even compare to a state level. So we'll describe those once we're able to move to the next slide.
Hi, sorry. PowerPoint is being funny for us. So give us just a second here.
And feel free to, while we have a little bit of a, time to ask any questions. If anybody has any questions about these measures, please feel free to enter them in the chat box so that we can address them either as they come up or as we move through the presentation. That would be great.
Yeah, the program's being funny for us. Let's hold that thought for a second. I see I've got some great folks on that I have some questions for. So hopefully people are feeling like up to answering questions. Getting called on, and I feel bad calling people out, but Ellen, hey Ellen, I see that you are on the line, and while we're getting our presentation pulled back up, I was wondering how things are going with the 2E CV ICU. So I know that a lot of our ICUs in general are going through huge transitions, and the 2E CV ICU is actually one of them. So I'm going to unmute you, Ellen, and just check in, and if you have a second and wouldn't mind sharing with us if 2E is going to be able to continue with the program and submit an action plan.
I'm sorry, I wasn't able to hear all of what you were saying. I heard up to the transition piece, and then it kind of cut out.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, so I was just saying a lot of our ICUs are undergoing huge transitions, and the CV ICU is definitely one of them. And so I was curious to know how things are going with your ICU, and if that one might be able to submit an action plan.
Yes, we are working on our action plan. We have put in place some education for use of the bladder scanners. We actually have 2 different bladder scanners now, so we've got education for both of those. Because one of the things we identified in the CTICU was that nurses were using it, but had never really been trained. So that kind of holds true for the CVICU as well. Together and getting ready to roll it out. We are actively in interdisciplinary rounds each day. We're bringing up, you know, if the patient has Foley, can we get rid of it? And agreeable. If they're not, it's like, okay, they've got a good reason and they'll say, but let's readdress it tomorrow. Coming along board well.
Oh, that's great news. I'm really glad to hear that. Ellen, my one ask of you would be if you wouldn't mind sharing with me your action plan so that I can get it entered into the CDS platform for the 2E. Not urgent, but when you have a moment.
We should have that done by this, hopefully by.
Perfect. Yay. Great. And I'm glad you were able to chime in, and thanks for letting me call on you and not being afraid to speak up.
No worries.
Be specific for your unit. Every unit might be different, but the next measures that we're going to talk about, the standardized infection ratio, or the SIR, and the standardized utilization ratio, or the SUR, those can actually be compared between units and between facilities. And so we're going to talk about those next. And we'll see if my control is back, and it is. Great. So these measures, the SIR and the SUR, they're collected for both CAUTI and CLABSI. These are measured quarterly from baseline, that baseline period, the 12 months before the project, to implementation, which is the 12 months of the project that you're participating in now. And so these measures look pretty simple on the, just looking at them. So they're just a ratio of the number of observed CAUTIs, for example, over the number of predicted CAUTIs. And for the SUR, the number of observed catheter days over the number of predicted catheter days. And so I think I can probably hear the questions already, well, how do we know what the number of predicted is? Who comes up with that? So that's a number that is actually calculated by NHSN, the National Healthcare Safety Network, and whoever enters in your healthcare-associated infections data for your facility, whatever information they put in, and it comes from a lot of different information that this system collects, essentially all of that information goes into a predictive model that statistically sorts out what factors predict certain numbers of infections. And so that takes into account things like facility size. It takes into account the acuity level of patients. So there's a lot of different factors that go into these models that calculate the predicted number of infections for each unit. And because essentially this is a risk-adjusted measure, so it takes into account differences between units or between facilities, the SIR and the SUR can actually be used to compare units to each other or to compare facilities to each other. And so let's look a little bit closer at these ratios here. So as an example, say that your unit has more observed CAUTIs than predicted. Your SIR is going to be greater than 1. And so based on some other statistical measures, we can potentially interpret this as this unit is performing worse than predicted by the national baseline. And so when we say the national baseline, this is essentially all of the data that NHSN pulled together to make these models is based on data entered for thousands of healthcare facilities, thousands of units across the United States for the year 2015. So we have all of this data, and essentially it's saying that this unit, this facility, had more CAUTIs in this example than predicted by the national baseline. Now, if you have the same number, your SIR is going to be 1. And so if you're doing sort of what would be predicted, the comparison value is 1. So an SIR greater than 1 means that you have more CAUTIs, you have more HAIs than you would be predicted to have. And so that's something to look at. That's what the number we want to see go down. If you have fewer CAUTIs than predicted by the national baseline, then your SIR is going to be less than 1. And those are the numbers that we like to see. We like to see that you're doing better than what you might consider the national average when it comes to CAUTIs. And like I said, this is a comparative measure. So it's already taking into account differences between unit types and facility types. And so you can actually compare, if you're a burn ICU, if you have an SIR, greater than 1, that means you have more CAUTIs than would be predicted for a burn unit like yours. And so the SUR, the standardized utilization ratio, is similar in that way. It's a comparable metric you can compare between units and facilities, but instead of measuring the number of infections, it's looking at device days, so urinary catheter days, central line days. And so similarly, if you have an SUR that's greater than 1, you have more device days than would be predicted. Does this mean that you're doing worse? Not necessarily. And that's something that's important to remember about the SUR, is that just because you have more device utilization than would be predicted, that's not necessarily meaning that you're overutilizing them or that you're using them incorrectly. But it might be something to look into about your practices. Why is it that we are using devices more than would be predicted? But it doesn't necessarily mean that it's inappropriate use. The same for if you have an SUR that is less than 1, so you have fewer device days than would be predicted. Doesn't necessarily mean that that's better. It could be that there are situations where a device would be warranted, but it's just something to look into, an additional step to take when you're looking at this data. And so in the interest of time, I'm going to move on from there so that we can get to looking at these graphs. Oops, and I've gone one too far now. So what will these look like in CDS? So you should be able to navigate to your data section so that you can look at your data. And so this top, I'm not sure if you can see, it looks like you can, yeah. If you can see my cursor, this is where you're going to tell CDS what data you want to look at. And specifically, if you want to look at these different measures, you'll use this measure here to tell the graph essentially what to populate. So it's important to know what measure you're looking at here, because the rate on this y-axis here, so that's going to be the measure that you're looking at. It's just going to say rate, but to know what you're looking at, you can either look up to this measure or look at this title. So here we're looking at the CAUTI rate per 1,000 urinary catheter days. This is not the SIR, this is just the rate for this unit. And so on the x-axis is the month, and the tick marks here look like they go every other month. So just be aware that, for example, your August data is between this July marker and this September marker. And so looking at this, you can see here that, for the most part, in that pre-intervention period, not a lot of CAUTIs, but then something happened here in August where they had an increased rate, brought it back down, and then, it kind of flared up again there. So that's how to, look at this metric, to look at your performance over time. And as you can see, it seems that they got that under control.
Hey, Katie.
So,
I just
yeah.
want to chime in real quick for folks. Now, for all of these slides, I have selected the chart view, but you could also click on the blue tab when you're actually in the platform and click on the data, and the data would show you the actual numbers and the rates if somebody wanted to see what the actual numbers corresponded to.
Thanks, Claudia. Yeah, that's a good thing to remember. Sometimes you like to see the chart, but if you want to do anything with that data, if you want to manipulate it in any way, good to know that that data is there in the table format so that you can download it and do other things with it. And so this next measure that we're looking at now is the standardized infection ratio. And so what's important to know about this is that both the SIR and the SUR are not calculated when the denominator of that measure, which is the number of predicted infections or the number of predicted device days, when that value is less than 1. And so this is to maintain the statistical integrity of this measure. If it's less than 1, there can be a lot of variability in the measure because you're dividing by something that's less than 1. So if you see a blank here, which is true of this graph here, that means that an SIR or an SUR cannot be calculated. So when that happens, don't panic. It's very common, especially when you get down to the unit level, because you're just one unit as part of a facility. You don't have a lot of events happening. You don't, unless you're a big unit, you're not going to be predicted to necessarily. So that's when you would want to make sure your infection ratio, but just the rate. Wanted to look at the SIR, potentially expand the frame to try to for that same time period. But as Claudia mentioned, if you and then sort of look at it basis instead of, so maybe if you looked at
but it didn't calculate, and it's not populating to the graph. And because of my ignorance, I didn't realize that when the denominator value is less than 1, it's not going to actually populate to the graph. So for those of you who may be looking at your unit level reports, there's nothing actually wrong with the graph. That is the way it is supposed to be. You will not have values calculated if your denominator, and again, you can see that in the data portion, is less than 1.
Exactly. Yeah. Thanks, Claudia. And but that, like I said, that's fine. If you want to compare, the SIR, the SUR are really useful for when you're trying to compare, to other units, or when you're at the facility level is trying to compare. Well, how are we doing compared to similar facilities? So if you're a small unit and you don't have that measure, it's still perfectly acceptable to use your unit-specific rates. Those are applicable, to your unit. They're not risk-adjusted, so you can measure your own progress over time using those rates. And we can have, other discussions about if you want some sort of benchmark to try to compare to other similar facilities, we can talk about that offline. And so the next measure that we're going to look at here is the urinary catheter utilization. And so that's the catheter utilization ratio. And this is, again, just for your unit. So this is collected and reported monthly. So you can see that you have a mark for each month. And, you know, you can see that kind of, you know, goes, you know, up and down. Maybe there's a slight trend over time, and a trend line is something you can add to these graphs, and I'll discuss that in one of the following slides here. But we're going to move on for the purposes of time because we are close, very close to time, if not already over. So then this next slide is the standardized utilization ratio. So this is that comparative metric. The SUR, because you're often going to have, you know, predicted number of device days. It's rarely going to be, you know, less than a certain threshold where they're worried about the integrity of that measure. So you might see an SUR, but not an SIR. You can look at this graph, and it will show you the SUR. And so again, the comparison to this is 1, and so the y-axis only goes to 0.8. So this means that this unit is using fewer devices than would be predicted according to the national baseline. And you can see that the trend, you know, maybe a little bit of increase at the beginning, but overall moving down. And my next slide, yes, should be those graph display options where you can tell the chart to put on certain types of trend lines to see how you compare to other units. So this is looking at specifically the SUR, but these options are available for any of your graphs, any of your measures. You can show organization data, which is your own. So that's I'm not sure if you can unselect this actually, but I would guess you'd want to see that all the time. You can do a trend line, which will show how your data has trended over time. The state average, which that is just going to be the average for that measure for that period of time for ICUs participating in the project. So it's important to know that that is not truly a state average. Our group here at Division of Public Health does have some estimates of that information for a truly statewide level, but you'll only be able to see here the average of other ICUs participating in the project in North Carolina. And then you can also do the all project average. And so that's going to be not just in North Carolina, but any other state that's participating in the project. So you can do the average, or you can also do the state median and the all project median as well. It's important to note that anytime you select one of these display options, in order to have it show up on the chart, you have to click this refresh chart button. And that's the end of that. So please, this is not the end all be all for data presentation. So if you have any questions, please let me know.
Thank you so much, Katie. And we are about 4 minutes over, so I just want to say, are there any questions for Katie? She is very well versed in the epidemiology and the data, and so she's fielded all of my questions, and I'm like, what? I don't understand this. So any questions at all for Katie? And then any general questions? Okay. Well, I would say then that is a wrap for us for today. Thank you so much for joining us.
We'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Claudia and Karen and Katie for leading us in today's discussion. This concludes today's session. We'd like to thank you all again for joining us. Today's session has been recorded and will be made available along with the slides on the NCHI website at the conclusion of today's session, and you may now disconnect. Thank you.